So we are in Orthodoxy 201, and we have been going through the section on the Logos. Last time we were talking about Marxism, and Marxism followed on nihilism, which followed on naturalism, which followed on the scientific revolution, which itself was based in the understanding that the world is and the universe are permeated by the Logos, that everything has meaning and purpose. And the shift towards naturalism was a shift away from that understanding, that Christian understanding, Judeo-Christian understanding of the world being a place of God's self-disclosure, his revelation, and it being a place that was absent of God. Nihilism is the absence of meaning and purpose, and meaning and purpose ultimately find their source in God himself. So nihilism is the absence of God from our thought, our philosophy, our culture, our life. And in that absence, there is a void. Marx saw history as a battle between the haves and the have-nots, those in power and those who are under their tyranny. In this continuous class struggle, he saw an opportunity for the underclass, the workers, the proletariat, to overthrow the owners, the ruling class, and that eventually there would be a classless society, a communist society. That was his goal. So capitalism became the enemy, and not just capitalism as an economic structure, but anything that was in power at the time, which included religion. There were many who were influential in not just in the Christian West, but in other parts of the world, including places like Russia or the Eastern European countries, which were Orthodox. And these people needed to be overthrown together with the capitalist systems. So Marx was very anti-Christ, very anti-Christianity, and we compared Christianity and Marxism, looking at these major topics. Then we spoke a little bit about communism, which again was the vision that Marx had for this classless society, which was no longer founded upon Judeo-Christian principles, morals, ethics, beliefs, but was really instituted by power. Nietzsche had this understanding of man having a will to power, and that the Superman would be the one who would eventually defeat others and establish new laws, new morals, new ethics, and would then rule the world under this new system. So communism was instituted through revolution, overthrowing economic systems, overthrowing the religious foundations of the people for generations. And in this revolution, there was much bloodshed. We looked at just some of the numbers around the world where communism was instituted, people who were put to death. And the numbers are staggering. The amount of blood that was shed is almost incomprehensible. We looked at Marx's view on religion as the opium of the people, that it was a distraction, that it was something that was to be done away with so that they could focus on what is, in his mind, the one thing needful. And that's a materialist worldview. It's about bread alone, right? Rather than God. His view was very narcissistic, very selfish. And this is in direct contrast and conflict with Christianity, which is about selflessness and love. We looked at some of the saints who were largely contemporaries with us and how they spoke out against communism and contrasted it with Christianity. We also looked at how Marxism has been masking itself under the guise of social justice. and how that kind of virtuous, let's say, call to justice in society has actually been a way for people to seize power, to sow division and conflict, to undermine stable governments and societies. In looking at the topic of social justice, we talked about the difference between equality and equity, and how the attempt to institute equity, which is basically equality of outcome, has failed in the numerous ways that it has been sought to be brought forward. So this kind of graphic here on the right, which many of you have seen on social media or other places online, points to that in a humorous way, but in a very real way, that equity, equality of outcome, is not something that can really be accomplished by the means that we have employed. And it's also perhaps not desirable. We looked at the parable of the talents, and this teaching that we see in this parable that, God gives to one 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, that's not an equality of opportunity. And at the end, he who has more will be given more. He who has less will, even what he has will be taken away. And that's not an equality of outcome. But each person is given according to their ability, and each person is rewarded according to their performance. And of course, we're not talking about the stock market, right? We're talking about the spiritual life. How much someone has used their God-given free will, which everyone receives in equal measure, everyone's equally free to love or not to love, right? And if we use that freedom well to love, we end up in union with others, with God and our neighbor. We share in communal life, which is the kingdom. If we don't use that freedom in that way, there is no love, there's no union, no communal life, and there's no kingdom. We looked at this quote from St. John Chrysostom, which speaks to us about the varied situation we all find ourselves in, and how there are rich and there are poor, there are sick and there are those who are healthy, and that those who are strong ought to help the weak, as St. Paul tells us. And that's how the world is united. So the seeming divisions that we have with regard to opportunity and outcome, that these can be overcome through Christian love, and the world can be united. We also looked at the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, and again, some quotes from our church fathers and mothers. And that ultimately brings us to the topic of the post-Christian West, because we see a falling away not just in those lands that have embraced revolution and socialism and communism, but we see a falling away in our own lands, in the West, meaning the United States of America or Canada, and also certainly in Western Europe. So if I can ask one of our readers, maybe Suzanne, can you lead us off tonight with taking the post-Christian West?
Sure. The term post-Christian West refers to societies in the Western world where Christianity is no longer the dominant religious or cultural influence. Here are some examples that illustrate this concept. Decline in church attendance. Many Western countries have seen significant drops in regular church attendance. For instance, in the United Kingdom, weekly church attendance has fallen to less than 5% of the population. Secularization of holidays. Traditional Christian holidays like Christmas and Easter have become more secular. The focus has shifted from religious observance to commercial and cultural celebrations. Religious diversity and pluralism. Western societies have become more religiously diverse, with growing populations of non-Christian faiths, such as Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. This diversity often leads to a more secular public sphere to accommodate various beliefs. Legislation and policy. Laws and policies in many Western countries increasingly reflect secular values. Examples include the legalization of same-sex marriage, and the removal of religious symbols from public spaces, as seen in France with the ban on wearing religious symbols in public schools.
Thank you, Suzanne. So certainly many of these things we have experienced very personally. The decline of church attendance, we know, let's say more broadly, with churches in the West. Maybe our individual parishes are doing okay, or not experiencing that to such a degree. Yet we know the statistics, we know the numbers. Certainly, we know the secularization of holidays. Christmas, which always has traditionally been about the birth of Jesus Christ, right? About the incarnation, the Savior of the world coming to us, has largely become about Santa Claus, gift giving, and family. Easter, spring break, celebrating, going down to Florida or wherever you're going on vacation, the Easter bunny, candy, things of that nature. And with regard to the religious diversity and pluralism, which in and of themselves have become ideals, right? Things that we want to encourage in our increasingly secular West, that has created actually greater, not just diversity, but division. People no longer share the same ethics and the same morals upon which our American nation was founded. With regard to legislation and policy, when we go through the timeline of the decline of America into this post-Christian state, we'll look at this in greater detail. So can I ask Marian to take this next slide, please?
Sure. Cultural shifts. Media and popular culture in the West often promotes secular or pluralistic values. For example, movies, TV shows, and music frequently explore themes of individualism, secularism, and relativism rather than traditional Christian morals. Educational systems. Public education systems in many Western countries emphasize secular humanism with less focus on religious education. In some places, religious instruction has been completely removed from the curriculum. Public opinion. Surveys and studies show a significant increase in the number of people identifying as nuns, those who claim no religious affiliation, in many Western countries. For example, in the United States, the percentage of people identifying as religiously unaffiliated has been steadily rising and is now around 30%.
Thank you, Marian. So certainly the cultural shift, we all know, you watch any TV show or you watch any movie, and you'll see that the themes are no longer Christian. The themes are anti-Christian. And if a series begins and seems to be wholesome, by the time you get to season number 2, once they've hooked you, everything goes south real fast. There's no question about that. I've seen that in numerous. I don't watch that much TV, right? But I do watch some, and that is a strategy that's employed. With regard to the educational systems, this does say in some places religious instruction has been completely removed from the curriculum. I would say in most places, if not almost all places now. And with regard to the surveys, some are shown here on the left in these charts. So in the US, smaller share of adults identify as Christians while religious nuns have grown. And you could see the decline there from higher percentages, 78% down to 65. And this is people who identify as Christians, and up from 16 to 26, those who are religiously unaffiliated, or the nuns, not NUNS, right? Those are the most dedicated of our Christian women, but those who have no religious affiliation. So on the right, you'll see a breakdown, and this is from changes between 2009 and 2019, so a period of about 10 years. Percentage points have declined for those who believe in the Lord, and they have risen for those who are non-believers. So both men and women have been equally affected. But when you look at the generations, so the older generation, the silent generation, only down 2 percentage points. However, when you look at millennials, down 16 percentage points. That is significant. And I wonder what the statistics would be for the next generation. What's after the millennials? I don't even know, but I bet it's probably worse as far as those who are not Christian anymore. As regard to ethnicity, you can see the numbers there, college education, geographical location. So you've got the Northeast, as probably isn't too surprising, taking a big hit with regard to the Christian faith. And then you have those who lean Republican or lean Democrat. The Democrats seem to be losing their faith in the Lord faster than the Republicans. However, both are down. And again, the rise of those who are religiously unaffiliated. So we see some of the statistics there, some of the numbers. Now, I'd like us to look at these quotes from Jordan Peterson and Douglas Murray that speak to us about what we're witnessing, what we're experiencing. So, Peter, can you take this one for us, please?
Certainly. Entering the void. We are seeing the collapse of our belief systems. We're becoming post-Christian, and that's dangerous because it means we're losing the structures that guide our moral actions. You can't just do that without consequences. If you remove the foundational presuppositions of Western civilizations, you're left with a void. And that's what post-Christianity is, trying to exist in that void without the guiding narrative that we've relied on for centuries. Jordan Peterson. One of the problems with the post-Christian West is that it believes it can hold on to the good things from Christianity, like human rights and equality, while discarding the belief that underpins them. This is deeply problematic. We are sawing off the branch on which we sit by discarding Christianity, which has been the foundation of our moral and legal systems. Without it, we are left floundering, trying to create meaning in a world that increasingly lacks coherence. When you remove the Christian bedrock of Western civilization, you're left with a void, and that void is being filled by ideologies that are often far less forgiving, far less humane. Douglas Murray. Postmodernism is the ideology that promotes the notion that there is no such thing as truth. The consequence of that is the only thing left is power. If you push a postmodernist far enough, they'll admit that. The question is, if you believe that, what do you do? And the answer is, you do whatever it takes to win. Jordan Peterson.
Thank you, Peter. So the illustration, I think, is very apt of one sitting on a branch and cutting off the very limb on which one is sitting. You can't survive that way. And certainly our civilization can't survive when we try to remove Christianity from the very foundations, the bedrock upon which our culture is built. In the absence of Judeo-Christian foundations and morals and ethics and the influence on our legal system, there is a void, right? That throne doesn't, remain empty for long. People will compete for it, and that is what we do see. The competition is always fierce within politics, but there's much more at stake now, because now we are fighting for who's going to determine the foundation for our future, that upon which we will be built. We're going to try to, build this new world order and globalism. Who's going to, set down the blueprint for that? So there definitely is this power struggle, and without an accountability to God, who has given us moral laws and ethics that we are mutually accountable for, without that, it is anything goes. Dostoevsky, said, without God, all things are permitted. And, if all things are permitted, you can do whatever it takes to win. And that's what we hear from Jordan Peterson, that you can do whatever it takes. The ends, justify the means. Okay, so let's look at some detailed list items of the timeline of descent and how things, increasingly have become more post-Christian. Suzanne, can you take this for us, please?
Timeline of descent. 1947, Everson versus Board of Education. The U.S. Supreme Court reinforces the separation of church and state, interpreting the Establishment Clause to apply to states. 1962, Engel versus Vitale. The U.S. Supreme Court rules that official prayer in public schools is unconstitutional. 1963, abolition of Bible reading in public schools. The U.S. Supreme Court rules that mandatory Bible readings in public schools are unconstitutional. 1966, Time magazine cover. The magazine famously asks, "Is God dead?" reflecting a growing secularization. 1960s, countercultural movement. The rise of the counterculture and the sexual revolution challenges traditional Christian values on sexuality and authority. 1973, Roe v. Wade. The U.S. Supreme Court legalizes abortion nationwide, igniting decades of debate and polarization between secular and religious Americans.
Thank you, Suzanne. So the Establishment Clause in 1947 being applied not just to the nation, but to individual states was a change, right? Because states did have in their constitutions reference to God in certain states. And I remember this when we were in Delaware. We had a class on church and state relationship. And we actually read the oath of office for the state of Delaware from time, memorial, and it spoke about the Holy Trinity. It spoke about belief in Jesus Christ as a Savior. And those who were going to be serving the state of Delaware confessed and pledged their faith and obedience to the Christian God. And that was something that wasn't that long ago, actually. And it was something that our founding fathers actually envisioned, that they did not envision a godless state. They envisioned a nation filled with faithful people. What they did not want was to have a national church, but they did envision that states would have churches that were dominant. Right, their people would be able to determine what church that would be, but there was an understanding that the people in America living in these states would be faithful people, and they would not divorce their church life from their civic life. Right? That radical separation between church and state was not envisioned by our founding fathers. They just simply didn't want a national church. So anyway, 1947, that changed. Then 62 and 63, no more prayer, no more studying of the scriptures. 1966, the question, is God dead? Jay already talked about that, right? Remember the quote we read about how his blood is on our hands. The countercultural movement, right? The 1960s. So this was a push against traditional Christian sexual ethics. And, it was all in the name of love, so to speak, right? And probably people thought, well, this is going to be the end. If we could just let people have free love and do what they want, then, there's no more that we need to push back on Christian values and sexual ethics. We'll come to our current situation in a moment as we see, the continued demise of our society with regard to sexuality and gender and all of that. Roe versus Wade, 1973, obviously, the legalization of abortion, which has been overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court, did do a lot of damage. And not just that, all of these, innocent babies and children suffered, but the legalization of it convinced many people that this was simply a medical procedure and that it was something that was okay. And there are countless good people who, under the influence of our society and culture, and under the trust in our government and our legal system to do what is morally right, people succumbed to the temptation of what seemed to be easier for them, what seemed to be the most expedient way, and have suffered greatly for this. So abortion, has hurt us terribly. It, in my personal estimation, is worse for this country than slavery has ever been. And I know that that's heresy today, right? Can't say that, but there's no one more innocent than a child in the womb. And if you're talking about, what has hurt the minorities in our country the most, it's hard to make a case for something more than abortion, right? Because abortion, when it was envisioned with Margaret Sanger, who was kind of the founder of Planned Parenthood, it was about controlling the population of minorities and exterminating those who were less than fully human, right? And this is not something that I'm not slandering her. You can read the history on this, and you can look into that for yourself. So again, a great scourge on this country in abortion. Okay, so who's next?
Marion.
Marion, do you mind taking it for us, please?
Sure. 1980s, rise of the religious right. In response to secularization, conservative Christians mobilized politically, influencing the Republican Party and shaping debates over morality, education, and public policy. 1990s, decline in church attendance. For the first time in decades, surveys show a major decline in church attendance and religious affiliation, notably among younger generations. 2001, 9/11, and aftermath. The terrorist attacks intensified debates over religious extremism, leading to increased secularism and suspicion of organized religion. 2012, religious nuns reached 20%. The Pew Research Center reports that 20% of American adults are religiously unaffiliated, a significant milestone in the secularization trend. 2015, Obergefell versus v. Hodges. The U.S. Supreme Court legalizes same-sex marriage nationwide, reflecting a shift in societal values that contrasts with Christian teachings. 2020, COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic accelerates the decline in religious participation as many churches close temporarily or shift to online services, leading to further disconnection from traditional religious practices.
2021, Gallup poll reports less than 50% church membership for the first time in over 8 decades of polling. Gallup reports that less than 50% of Americans belonging to a church or religious community.
Thank you. So some things here. We looked at the 1960s, which took sex out of the context of marriage. Then we have in 2015, marriage itself is redefined. In time, and not much time, within a decade of that, we're now redefining who a man is and who a woman is, right? We have rapidly changed foundational things, and not just with regard to our Christian faith, but with regard to biology, with regard to that which is natural law, right? So things have changed rapidly with regard to sexuality and gender as we have become more and more secular, right? You can see these two things converging. The rise of those who are religiously unaffiliated and the rise of those who do not believe in absolutes, who do not believe in that which has always been accepted as simply natural. All of that is up for grabs. Everything can be reworked, revisited, reimagined, right? This is the terminology that we use, and it's actually seen as a good thing, to find a new way, right? It's progressive. It's, making progress towards a brighter future. And yet actually things are getting much darker. We're not moving towards the light, we're moving towards darkness. We're not moving towards truth, we're moving towards falsehood, and not moving towards unity, we're moving towards division, right? So this is happening again in an increasingly rapid fashion. And this is focusing primarily on America. If we looked at the countries in Western Europe, you would see this as well. And some are further along. Okay, let's talk a little bit about now the fruits of apostasy. So we looked at the timeline of some of the major events. Now we'll talk a little bit more about what has changed with regard to our culture and our life as members of this country that we live in, the United States. So Peter, can you take this one for us, please?
Sure. Fruits of apostasy. The transition to a post-Christian era where secular and religious worldviews become more prevalent has had various social, cultural, and moral implications. Here are some of the negative consequences. Normalization of immorality. The acceptance and normalization of behaviors considered immoral by traditional Christian standards, such as extramarital sex, substance abuse, and other activities seen as contrary to biblical ethics. Same-sex marriage. The legalization and social acceptance of same-sex marriage, which is contrary to biblical teachings on marriage and sexuality. Gender ideology. The acceptance of non-binary and fluid gender identities, which conflict with traditional Christian teachings on gender being created as male and female.
Thank you, Peter. So that graphic in the top right is actually taken from a state-issued teacher's manual. And this is to prepare teachers for dealing with their students who, could be anywhere on the spectrum, anywhere on this matrix of gender identities versus their birth sex. This is a small chart, by the way. This can be expanded and be more inclusive. And of course, we want to be as inclusive as possible. So the expansion of these different gender identities is almost really limitless. And you can certainly see the LGBTQ plus agenda having support even in the White House. The next slide deals with abortion and euthanasia. And Suzanne, I think we're back to you if you don't mind.
Abortion. The acceptance of abortion in post-Christian societies can be seen as both a cause and a consequence of broader cultural shifts, including changes in attitudes toward sexuality, family, and the role of religion in public life. As Christian influence wanes, we see a devaluation of human life and a move towards a more utilitarian view of existence, where the worth of life is measured by its convenience or desirability. Euthanasia is increasingly viewed through a lens of personal choice and quality of life, rather than the intrinsic value of life itself. Suffering is increasingly seen as something to be avoided at all costs, leading to greater acceptance of euthanasia as a means to alleviate pain and preserve dignity. The acceptance of euthanasia raises concerns about the potential for abuse, particularly for vulnerable populations, such as the elderly, disabled, or those with mental illness.
Thank you, Suzanne. So very recently, in fact, this past week, the Democratic National Convention was held. And one of the things that they were advertising is that they were offering free abortions. So if you went, you could get an abortion for free. And they were celebrating this. That should be something that turns the stomach and is so repulsive to any human being. But it has become something that is, it's okay because one of the political parties is supporting that and endorsing that. And in America, we support everybody in politics. You can politic for whatever you want. We're all equally free and we have rights. And it doesn't matter, again, what it is we're advocating for, because anything goes. This is how far we have fallen by deifying, making godlike our freedom, right? Freedom to do whatever we want without any kind of accountability. And it has been enshrined again in political life. So if you were to speak against it, you're anti-democratic. To say that there must be some kind of limits, there have to be some kind of bounds of that which is acceptable or tolerable. And those limits, those bounds have increasingly been pushed back and expanded to the point where, I'm not sure that there are any left. We're getting pretty close to that. With regard to euthanasia, it's not as prevalent as abortion. However, it's should be, as disconcerting. The elderly and their lives are of no less value than anyone else. And the rise in government control and mandates should be something that is disconcerting to us, because the more power the government has to control healthcare and the rights of its citizens to that healthcare, the more the chances of really the worst outcomes happening. Big government is one of the things that has increased. We saw the rise in the nuns, but we're also seeing a rise in the size of government and its influence on the lives of the citizens of this country. That void that has to be filled, right, isn't just being filled by individuals. It's being filled by political parties and their ideologies. And it's being filled by government bureaucracy, which has grown and grown. Regulations, continually get added to the book. Laws get added to the books. Someone once said that, if you give to Caesar that which is God's, Caesar never gives it back. Government gets larger and larger. It doesn't get smaller. And with its increase in size, it's the strong hand of the government has further and further reach into the most sacred times of life, which is birth and death, natural death, right? So abortion and euthanasia. Now, as again, we're pushing these borders and these limits on that which should be accepted, we get to transgenderism and wokeism. So Marion, are you up next?
Yes, transgenderism raises concerns about the medical risks and long-term effects of hormone treatments and surgeries, questioning their safety and effectiveness. Separating gender identity from biological sex challenges traditional notions of identity and creates implications for women's rights and single-sex spaces. Concerns include fairness in sex-segregated sports, privacy issues in gender-specific facilities, and potential legal conflicts regarding free speech and religious freedoms. There are also debates over the financial impact of transgender healthcare and its ineffective treatment of mental health issues. Wokeism is a modern social and political ideology focused on heightened awareness of social injustices, particularly those related to race, gender, and identity. It advocates for the recognition and rectification of systemic inequalities and emphasizes the importance of language and behavior in supporting marginalized groups. Critics argue that wokeism can be overly prescriptive, dogmatic, and intolerant of dissenting views, often leading to cancel culture and the suppression of free speech. Supporters see it as a necessary movement for social progress, while detractors view it as an illiberal force that divides society into oppressors and the oppressed.
Thank you, Marion. So transgenderism is becoming increasingly in the news. It used to be an issue with schools and bathrooms and things like this. Then it came into the realm of sports. Even the Olympics was not without transgender issues. And they're on the rise. They're becoming more prevalent. And I think probably we should anticipate more and more of that. Wokeism, the idea of being woke, was initially the idea of just being awake to the plight of minorities or people who are oppressed. In a sense, it's good to be woke in that sense. However, it has morphed into something different. It has now become the oppressor, right? Wokeism, with its supporters having great power with regard to influence, with regard to politics, with regard to finances, all of that is being leveraged to push an agenda, to push forward a new view. And if you do not accept that new view, if you have what is now a minority opinion, you will be crushed by wokeism. And if you're not following that, it's the very inverse of what wokeism was initially about. Wokeism was about seeing the little guy and making sure that they were not crushed. Now, wokeism has grown and has become the big guy. And if you are the little guy and you have a different viewpoint, minority viewpoint, you will be crushed. So that's the nature of how this Marxist class struggle works. You know, when you get to the top of the mountain, you've got to hold your position, and you hold your position by keeping down those who are below you. The very thing that you were fighting against, which was oppression or tyranny, now you implement because you're in control. So wokeism, again, started as something that was with good intentions and has morphed into something else. Okay, I mentioned big government. Let's talk a little bit more about that, and then also the rise of globalism. Peter, are we back to you?
Okay, big government. In the post-Christian West, the rise of big government is characterized by expanding state intervention in various aspects of life, including marriage, healthcare, education, and social welfare. This trend reflects a shift from individual responsibility and religious charity towards state-led solutions to social issues. As traditional Christian values of self-reliance and communal support wane, the state increasingly assumes roles previously filled by religious institutions and private entities. This expansion is often justified on the grounds of equality, social justice, and economic stability, but it also raises concerns about personal freedoms and the growing influence of government in daily life. Rise of globalism. In a post-Christian world, the rise of a one-world government is often driven by globalist ideals emphasizing unity, economic integration, and collective problem solving. As traditional religious values decline, there's increased support for centralized governance to address global challenges like climate change and inequality. This shift seeks to transcend national boundaries and foster global cooperation, but it also raises concerns about national sovereignty and the loss of local cultural and moral traditions.
Thank you, Peter. So on the left, there are a couple of illustrations. You can see the gentleman who's a little bit bloated, perhaps we should say, or has not been to the gym in some time, but is getting big, though not muscular, right? That is what's happening to our government. Our government is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and its arm has farther and farther reach. Certainly, we know that having lived through the COVID pandemic, and many of us, have seen how our state governments or the national government have, in seeking to address a medical issue, have taken upon themselves greater and greater power, greater and greater reach, and have used that to foster and advance political agendas. There is really not much question about that. Even, politicians are known to say something to the effect of, you don't want to waste a good crisis, right? That the crisis is an opportunity for government to step in and to take greater and greater control. And again, once the government has taken that control, precedent has been set, and we have become, as citizens, have become accustomed to that. So the next time something happens, we can almost anticipate the same thing happening on the part of government, except for on a larger scale, to a greater degree. That's the nature of how government grows. It grows incrementally over time to the measure that we as citizens are willing to accept it and to tolerate it. Again, in this void, it has to be filled by those who have the will to power, and they will get away with as much as they can get away with. It's very difficult for those who have power to give it up. Usually those in power want more and more of it. So we do see a rise of government in the United States, but also a rise of one world government. In the Christian era, you did have a sense of world government, right? A sense of even, one kingdom, but that was the kingdom of God with, the King of Kings sitting on the throne, and we were all accountable to him. And that throne, again, being empty, is now being filled by those who are not God. Those who are simply human beings. And that same influence and authority that Jesus Christ had over the world, they want for themselves. So, this move towards secularism and diversity, it's not simply about allowing people to be free and allowing people to choose what they want. It's about using freedom and diversity and all of these things which before in a Christian context were good because we had a good God at the top of the pyramid. Now, as human beings seek to take the place of God, because they are not good, we are not good. Freedom and diversity are actually not leading to unity. They're leading to greater and greater struggle, division, warfare, revolution. And as we saw, in the socialist and communist states, bloodshed. Now, I don't want to in any way scare anyone, but what would make things different for us? How could it go differently for us as opposed to how it went for those communist nations? They seem to be on a more accelerated path, but are we not walking that same road? Are we not following those same steps? And I leave that, to your own assessment. But I do want to raise the question so that, you can think about that. What direction are we going in this post-Christian West, and specifically in America? Where are we heading? What are the fruits of our apostasy from God? So I submitted those, kind of themes for your consideration. And next time we'll pick up on the war on words, or logi, because again, this whole discussion of the post-Christian West is in the context of this chapter on Jesus Christ as the Logos, right? So we're turning away from the Word of God. We're turning away from the meaning of things, the meaning of words themselves, the inner principles and logi that permeate creation. So we're turning away from not just the creator, but also the creation, not just the word of God, but also the words that establish, the meaning and purpose of all things. So we'll look at some of this next time, but I think we'll close it at this juncture.